Hey, Walt, do you mind running to the shops for me and getting me some galangal?
What on earth is galangal?
I actually have no idea. It's for this new recipe I'm trying for dinner tonight. Let me Google it. Here we go. It's a root. Apparently it's similar to ginger, more shiny and whiter skin, apparently, and a pinier, more citrusy aroma.
Oh, yeah. I think I've used this before. It's used in Southeast Asian cooking, right?
Yeah, although it says I need it in powder form.
Right. So do you have to, dry it out and blend it or something?
I don't know. It doesn't say anything here in the ingredients section, and, well, Google really isn't showing me much.
Well, have a look in the method part of the recipe. How are you meant to use it?
Oh, yeah, right. Good idea. Well, it says I have to use the powder to make a coconut milk-based sauce to baste the cauliflower in. Then I take the basted cauliflower and bake until near golden brown, then flambe to a crisp, then sous vide the diced not sliced courgette to blend into a paste with a V8 powered super blender, put onto low to mid to high heat for 27 minutes and 42 seconds. Whilst waiting, julienne the vegetables and place on the second shelf in the freezer to cool to a crisp. Finally, serve over rice with a slide of roti.
Simple. But we only have one of those electric blenders from Target.
Well, I guess we're having cereal then. That does sound like a recipe we did a lot of that kind of cooking in lockdown, where we just try and overdo it because we had so much time.
It's definitely a lockdown recipe of going I've got all the
day
time that I could ever
What's
want.
the most complicated dish I could possibly make today to fill in the endless void of all these lockdowns?
Welcome to the Get Commanded podcast by the Greensboro Commander community. It's the GCP by the GCC and POG, Palms Off Gaming, sponsor of this podcast. We're all uniting forces to help you to have better games of Commander. I'm your host, Walt.
And hello, Commander players. I'm your other host, James. Now, if you're already in our Discord, you might have seen me put a post up maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, where I said, hey, Walt, I've just checked our inbox and I'm terrified of an upcoming transmission. This episode is that transmission that I was terrified of. So what my segue is here, if you want to support Walt and I's traumatic experience of having to do these episodes to you guys, you can support us directly
by
on
giving
Patreon.
us money.
Yeah, it softens the blow of approaching really complicated Magic the Gathering topics.
I think you're right. I think I could really bear anything for just $4. $4 measly dollars.
Yeah, it does make this episode feel a little bit better knowing that we have some Patreons that are we love that you have to do the research for these episodes. Here's a few gold coins.
You know what, James? You've been abducted 4 or 5 times. Have a couple of bucks.
Yeah, we go through some serious pain and going to different corners of the universe. If you go to patreon.com/getcommandedpodcast, you can help us get therapy.
Yep. You'll pay for our ride home from the edge of the Milky Way, where we get dropped off after every one of these episodes.
Well, look, we thank everyone for supporting us on Patreon. But yeah, you can go check out all the amazing benefits that there are for you and support the great content that we make here. But as alluded to, do you want to get to the transmission? Because it's a big one.
The light is blinking. It's an incoming transmission from the deep depths of the galaxy, from the Space Commanders. It's time to get commanded.
The Magic the Gathering Comprehensive Rules is a 281-page document as of Earth date June 16th, 2023. Commander has the largest card pool of any Magic the Gathering format. The result is enormous complexity in the variety of rules a player is likely to encounter in a game. How does a Commander player navigate this vast array of rules?
So I hope the listeners can realize why I was terrified about this, because we are not judges.
No, we are definitely not.
We are the furthest thing from judges, which is not a judge at all.
Yeah.
No training at all.
We, I'm sure, get rules wrong every episode of this podcast. It's likely. I think we're reasonably good at checking ourselves and going, how does that actually work? And looking up cards on our phone. That one helps a lot. But yes, we're not judges. So I guess we're going to have to find our get commanded way of approaching the rules and how to navigate them with the big caveat of telling you all, we're not judges. So, like, our expertise is not judging and the rules. And if that's what you're looking for, it's not us. We don't have that.
This is the great thing about our Discord server is we have some judges in that Discord server.
We do.
And I actually called in Ellie, one of our judges in that Discord server, to tackle this command with us.
Cool.
So this episode was prepared for because I don't really want to get anything wrong, and I know you don't either.
No.
So checking it with a judge first was like the best way we could go about this. And Walt and I have a lot of continuing ongoing dialogue with judges, and we have people check what we're saying. So we try and get we're trying as best as we can to make sure we're not getting rules wrong. But we really do want to preface, we are not judges.
Yeah. But also, I'm really glad we got this transmission because, our judges in our Discord server answer a lot of questions very frequently.
On the daily.
Yeah, and some of those questions could even just be worded better, and I'm sure that's something we'll look at in this episode is, we want to support our judges because they're really helpful. They're really lovely people that me and James play Commander with, play other formats with frequently.
Yes.
So I'm glad we get the opportunity to kind of support the work that they do in our Discord server.
Yeah, and I think that, like, often judges are often perceived as, like, you remember when you're a student sitting an exam and the invigilator walks past your desk and your heart, like, starts beating really quickly because they're checking out what I'm doing. I hope I'm not breaking the rules.
Yes.
The cool thing about judges in this context, if you're playing at a tournament or you're playing at one of our Commander events where it is judged, all that kind of thing, judges aren't meant to be scary. They are genuinely meant to be there to help and support you with just making the game work, because honestly at the end of the day the game is meant to be there to be fun, but the game has to work for it to be fun. Playing with a broken toy is not fun.
No, it's not.
I guess we should start off because like the Space Commander specifically wanted us to approach complex rules, and how do we actually approach the vast array of rules in the Commander space, because there's so many of them.
We have so many. Like, when you play... I was telling this to someone the other day, a friend of mine who's just got into Magic, Josh, who we've mentioned a couple of times on the podcast
Shout
before.
out, Josh.
He's a great case study for new players.
It's been a really good opportunity for this podcast, actually.
Thanks, Josh. But yeah, he asked me the other day, I was telling him about draft, and he said, like, oh, is it very hard to learn how to do draft? And I was like, it's hard to do it well, but actually it's an easier format to learn than Commander.
You have less cards to learn.
And far fewer mechanics. Like, each set that comes out has, like, a few evergreen mechanics, as they call them. Mechanics like lifelink that pop up in Trample, pop up in almost every single set. And then they'll have, like, 2 or 3 mechanics in the set that come up all the time. But other than that, when you're playing draft, that's all you're dealing with. Cards from this set, rules from this set. Whereas, when we play Commander, it's everything else.
Yeah, like Lord of the Rings, I had to learn what the ring tempts you meant.
Yeah.
And then I was ready to draft. I was ready to do the pre-release. But
it's basically the main mechanic in that set. There's food tokens, but even those we've seen before,
But then you get like this common expression that comes out, like with a food token. A lot of people would be like, oh, how does this card work? And you'll guarantee hear someone say, oh, reading the card explains the card.
Yeah, it's sort of a facetious kind of thing that we get.
Yeah.
It does work sometimes, admittedly. But you hear the professor say this a lot of the time as well.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important to note that this expression is a colloquialism used by experienced Magic players to kind of go, oh, good one, stupid. That's not how your card works.
If you just read the card, you'd work it out. And look, sometimes it does help to read it first. I think it's a good starting point, probably. I don't think it's the catch-all, answer-all questions thing, though, that Magic the Gathering players make it seem like it is.
Yeah.
It's a starting point. It's okay, read the card. Does it make sense? Okay, maybe not.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. And especially for new players, I think there's a bit of an onus on experienced players to use this phrase, reading the card explains the card, in like situations where they know it's applicable. Like for a new player, it could come across quite rude if someone was to be like, "Oh, reading your card explains the card, idiot." Go like, but I actually can't understand it. And there's good reasons why reading the card will not explain what the card is doing.
It's true. Well, I think the big thing it does is it misses a lot of the detail that's happening behind the words on the card.
Yeah. Well, like the Space Commander said, our rules document is 281 pages.
Yeah, I mean, even if you were just to look at, like, just to start off with, keywords.
Yeah, good example.
Just keywords. There are so many words in Magic, for those who may not know, that have been, like, shortened from what they used to say into just a single word, usually. Yeah. So, lifelink is one, right? Yep. That used to say on the card, whenever this creature deals damage, it causes its controller to gain that much life. That's a lot of words.
Long sentence.
Now it just says lifelink. And we know, as Magic players who've played for a while, that that's what it means when it says lifelink on a card.
Even just recently, like I know mill has just become an actual keyword. Or like an actual word. Like, I'm not sure if it's classified as a keyword now.
No, it would be, because it says like mill 2 or mill 3.
It's an ability that says, right, the word mill means to take the top 2 cards of your library, if it's mill 2, take top 2 cards, put them into your graveyard.
Yeah.
Before, it would actually say, player takes top X cards of library and puts them into their graveyard.
Yeah, they're quite frequently keywording these when they realize players are aware enough of what they do. Like, quite a recent one was Surveil.
Yes.
It's also been keyworded now. So this is the mechanic that says, like, look at however many cards on the top of your library and then put them either back in any order or in your graveyard.
Kind of like scrying, but to the bin.
Yeah, it's like scrying, but instead of the bottom, you put them in the graveyard. Yeah, exactly. And that is now a keyword. Yeah. So the card Consider used to say all that text on it, now just says Surveil 1, look at that card, put it in graveyard or put it back, draw a card. That's what it says now. It just says Consider 1, Surveil 1, draw a card.
Yeah, and I think that the interesting thing with like keywords is how they've managed to make an entire sentence one word, which you know what means that they can do? They can put more words onto the card. So it can also have lifelink and it can have surveil, but then it also does this entire paragraph of text as well.
It's the absolute dream for the Wizards of the Coast game designer in 2023.
Questing Beast.
Slaps top of card. This baby can fit so many words on it.
So much spaghetti can fit in this card.
Exactly right.
Well, look, I think keywords are one thing that make things confusing because like one word to explain an entire effect, but also like some cards are just confusingly worded.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the way Magic rules work. Some cards are just worded in a particular way so they don't break their own rules.
Yeah.
So, like, you have to word it out in this, like, weird 3-sentence long explanation. Otherwise, it wouldn't be as good or it would be too good.
Yeah. There's so many of those. There's enough of those that I think we should just have a whole section on that. So maybe, so what do we have? We've got keywords.
We've
got confusingly worded cards. There's so many of those.
Yeah. I guess the last one would be just, like, really complex rules, right?
Yeah. Just, like, stuff that straight up bends your brain to think about. Yeah, okay.
So there are 3 targets for this section. Well, look, I've got a way to attack the first one.
Keywords?
If you would appease me for a second.
Uh-oh.
We've done this a few times on the podcast where we kind of quiz each other.
Oh, no.
You forced me to answer questions about my own decks in the past.
I think I've done specifically that version of the quiz many times now.
Well, I'm going to introduce you to a new quiz show.
Okay.
I'm calling it the Keyword Quiz Show.
Okay.
So, I've now got in front of me on my phone the section of the rules document that is, by the way, section 702.1. Yes, that's how far down keywords sit in the section of the rule document.
Sure.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose 7, I'm going to do 7 questions to you. And you're going to have to explain what each keyword does. You're going to have to summarize the keyword ability.
So if this keyword was expanded out, what would that full text be? So like with lifelink before, where the card just says lifelink on it, but if it was like, what does it actually do? It says if the creature deals damage, it causes its controller to gain that much life. So I have to say that. I'm going to say the keyword. Okay. And you're going to have to... What I'm going to do is I'm going to get you to summarize it, because I think word for word reading the rule would be challenging, because you've not read the rules document. So I'll justify whether your summary or not is good. Okay. But to add a little bit of extra spice in it, I'm going to have to get you to determine whether it's a static, triggered, or activated ability as a keyword. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Cool. So, like,
do we know the rules?
Sure, let's do it.
Let's dive right in. Yeah. I'm going to do it so it gets progressively harder.
Okay, so we'll do starting wheel.
Yeah,
easy.
So, question 1, reach.
Reach.
So is
Reach
it
says
static, triggered, or activated first?
it's definitely not triggered or activated. This is a static ability.
It is, correct.
This reach is creatures with reach may block creatures with flying, more or less.
A creature with... Yes, that's basically what it says.
A creature with reach
yes.
can block creatures with flying as though it had flying.
Yes,
whatever.
yeah, that's basically how it's worded. And like the one thing that is added on to this as a subsection of the rule, which is interesting because it happens a lot with these keywords, is multiple instances of reach render it redundant.
Oh yeah, you can't have double reach.
Yeah.
It doesn't block something with double flying.
Yeah,
Once
exactly.
you got reach again. It's just still reach.
Unless you're playing some weird unset that double flying works.
Let's just collectively agree that unsets break all the rules.
Okay, so tick one.
Okay,
You've got
one
reach.
for one. Sure.
Another one, pretty easy to do. Haste. Is it static,
Haste.
activated, triggered first, and then you can summarize?
Still static.
Correct.
Creatures with haste may attack and tap the turn that they, as though they didn't have summoning sickness.
Correct. I'll give you the correct because you've answered it. But the really interesting thing that I found in the actual rules document is they've actually separated attacking and activating tap abilities separately.
Oh,
Which is interesting because there are some instances where a creature can say this creature can activate abilities as if it had haste.
that's true. There's also a lot of really old cards that say this creature may attack as though it had haste, but not necessarily activate abilities. There's a really cool old aura called Instill Energy that I play in a few decks.
Yes.
This is the mono green thing that you can untap the creature once per turn, but only on your turn or something crazy like that. But it says on it, the creature may attack as though it had haste, but it can't activate abilities as though it had haste, which is very interesting.
So I think that's why they've separated those two things in the rules. All right, so 2 for 2.
Yeah.
Your third one, indestructible.
Indestructible is still a static ability.
Mm-hmm.
Indestructible says effects that would destroy this permanent don't? Question mark?
You're pretty close. I'll give it to you.
Okay.
You're definitely not going to be hired to write for the rules document anytime soon.
You can write don't question mark on the rules.
You're right. A permanent with indestructible can't be destroyed. Such permanents aren't destroyed by lethal damage, and they ignore state-based actions that check for lethal damage.
Right. So it's specifically stipulating that because, as we know as well, it's different from if the things can still technically die if they're indestructible. They just can't be destroyed or dealt lethal damage.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's why it's very specifically worded in the rules document.
Interesting. I like that.
We're getting a little bit more challenging now.
So 3 for 3 so far.
3 for 3, but we're getting into the challenging zone now.
Okay, sure.
Flanking.
Oh, why?
Oh, I've got him.
Oh, okay.
Okay, firstly, think about, because you got to answer, is it static, activated, or triggered? Is flanking a static, activated, or triggered? That might actually help you answer
Flanking is a triggered ability?
Correct. Very nice.
So creatures with flanking, when they're blocked, the blocking creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn?
Alley-oop, he gets it. Well done.
I was not confident in that.
That was I threw that in there because I was like, I know you've played melee and all these other abilities. Flanking's probably one you've not seen often.
I think I've just read the reminder text on it enough times. I've got a couple of cards with flanking on them, and so whenever I see them, I always what does that do again? And then I read it. So I think it's in the back of my mind. Okay, cool.
All right, well,
4 for 4.
4 for 4. The fifth question is going to be a spot the difference round.
Oh no.
From recent sets,
Okay.
I would like you to identify the difference between these two keywords. Poisonous and toxic.
I know this one. I actually know this one.
He played a couple of limited events for all we want, apparently.
Well, also, because there was a big discussion when Toxic came out, and people were like, isn't this just poisonous again? And it's not.
It's not.
And
there is a difference.
I see now why you asked me to separate the abilities by what they are, because poisonous is a triggered ability, but toxic is a static ability.
Hey, he absolutely nailed it.
And
correct.
This is why they've done it, is because poisonous creatures technically would say, when this creature deals combat damage to a player, they get a poison counter.
Correct. Or they get
poisonous
poison counters.
numbers of
however
poison
much
counters.
it's assigned to.
Whereas toxic is worded more like lifelink, where it says damage dealt by this creature causes the player to get that many poison counters, which is better because you shouldn't be able to respond to someone getting poison counters. That's not a good idea. So I'm glad that's not the case.
Well, toxic has been now said to be like a fixed version of poisonous.
I don't think now they've got toxic they'll ever print a poisonous card. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, the interesting thing about toxic as well, which you didn't include in your answer, I'm going to give you the full point anyway, but if a creature with toxic 2 gains an ability toxic 1...
Oh, it becomes toxic 3.
It does become toxic 3.
They kind of stack up in this way.
That's why I kind of highlighted...
Makes it better.
Yeah.
Okay.
I highlighted before how like multiple instances of reach are stupid. But multiple instances of toxic...
actually work really well. Or they work well for the player who is giving something more toxic.
Correct. Okay, we are in the final 3 and it's going to get really tricky from here.
Okay.
Your next keyword, Walt, is forecast.
Forecast.
Okay,
Cast
firstly...
4 times?
Forecast.
No, I'm kidding.
It's storm, but slightly worse. No, you have to first think activated, triggered, or static. It might help your ability to answer the question.
Okay, I think I have seen forecast before. I think forecast is a activated ability.
Yes, technically you are right.
Okay, so forecast cards... I'm sorry, I'm walking through the process. Forecast cards often have like a text on them that says you can reveal it from your hand and pay the forecast cost, and then you just like add that effect to the stack or whatever. It's like it's an activated ability that puts a thing on the stack, but it uses the card in your hand, but it goes back to your hand. I don't know if that's enough information to answer your question, but that's my understanding of how forecast works, having never played a single forecast card in my life.
Okay, I am unfortunately going to have to say you got this wrong.
No.
Because you missed one very important thing about the forecast activated. You're right, it is an activated ability from hand. You reveal it from hand to put something on the stack, but you can only do it in your upkeep.
Oh, it's this stupid thing.
Yes.
This is why I'm not playing it.
It's so bad. But basically, a card that I think that I have played before that actually has forecast is actually not terrible. It's not that playable either. Piercing Rays. It has a forecast cost of 1 and a white. So in your upkeep, you reveal it for 1 and a white. And the forecast ability says tap target creature. Then you can cast the spell for 1 white and it says exile target tapped creature.
Oh.
So the whole point of the mechanic is that you're meant to be forecasting what's about to happen.
What you're going to do, yeah.
So forecasting Piercing Rays and then casting it is essentially 3 mana exile target creature.
It's very flavorful, I will say. Yeah, okay. No, I like the mechanic as an idea because it's also a good way to get players to go like, without having drawn your card,
do you want to do something
you want to do
now?
this now, or do you want to see what the card is? But you only have this chance. I like it as a mechanic. It's pretty bad and not.
And it's not very
playable.
intuitive.
No,
either.
it's not.
It's only ever. I think it got a few cards reprinted in Modern Horizons 1 or 2.
Okay.
So a while ago, but like, yeah, really not that intuitive.
Damn. Okay, so I've lost that one.
Okay, so we are now at the very pointy end. We're on question 6. Your keyword is unleash.
Oh, yeah.
I told you it gets harder.
That was my... James didn't know this coming into this quiz.
Oh, was this like your standard deck back in like the early 2000s?
No, James. It's way weirder than that. I was a Russian spy for a large number of years, and my activation word was unleash.
He's
So I am now a Russian spy. I am marching around the room. I will kill you, James. I will kill you on this spot.
This is why we need a cat. Walt literally just jumped up and ran around the room.
Okay,
Other than your triggered word that turns you into a Russian super agent,
look, James.
what does unleash do?
There's something you should know about me, and we discovered this in one of the previous quizzes where I tried to guess the names of the 4-color things.
Oh yeah, the pairing.
I would much rather
give an answer that you're happy with giving.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Which
You
is
go for it.
Suitably really stupid.
Okay,
then be like admit that I just don't know.
So
don't know.
if someone cast unleash on like someone cast a card with unleash on it, what would you, as the player playing against them, instantly think that card does?
invites me to kill them. I just told you this, James.
Activate the Russian.
I kill this button.
This one absolutely stumped me when I came across
I've
it.
never heard of this in my life.
What's really confusing is that not only is it a static ability, it's actually two static abilities. This keyword represents two different static abilities. Yeah, it's confusing. So Unleash basically means you can have this permanent enter the battlefield with an additional +1 counter on it. That's the first static ability because it enters with the counter.
Okay.
Right? The second static ability says this permanent cannot block as long as it has a +1 counter on it.
Oh.
Now, I double checked with a judge on this one. Yes, if you give a creature with Unleash without a +1 counter on it a +1 counter, it now can't block.
Oh, even if it's not the +1 counter that it put on itself.
Correct.
It just straight up the static ability is, if this gets a counter, can't block.
Exactly right.
That's pretty funny.
It's weird, but it's two static abilities on one keyword.
Wild.
Wacky.
I've never played a set where that was relevant before, as you can probably tell.
All right.
By my killing of James. Yeah, sure. Let's find out if something else will make Walt go weird.
Well, if Unleash did that, I'm terrified for this keyword.
Uh-oh.
The keyword is frenzy.
Frenzy. Like, you're in a bar.
Yeah, just full-on friends.
Yeah, and someone says, "Hey, what?
That's Fonzie.
What are you..."
I didn't realize this would be so fun.
I had a full
Frenzy.
scenario there, but I'm leaving it behind.
Fonzie's better.
I have no idea.
Okay,
I have no idea,
I'm not
afraid.
surprised you didn't know this one because this keyword has only ever appeared on one creature
Oh my god.
all time. And it was a sliver that gave other slivers you control Frenzy 1.
Okay.
So Frenzy is a triggered ability, which I'm really not shocked. By the way, this was in Future Sight, so no wonder why we haven't seen this printed again.
For those who don't know, Future Sight was a set where the Magic designers tried to predict the future of their own game by giving colors and creatures and stuff abilities they normally wouldn't have.
Or things that kind of sound like they could be a magic thing, but aren't yet a magic thing. Or could... Like Planeswalkers were first referenced in Future Sight.
Yes, there was it said it referred to all of the card types, and one of them that was referenced was Planeswalker, which how we knew it was coming.
Yeah.
But they also gave, this is where Harmonize comes from, the 4-mana sorcery that, in green that gets you to draw 3 cards. That's a copy of a blue card.
Also Pyrohemia came from here.
There's one of those. There's a white bolt, I think. I think Sunlance might be a Future Sight card.
Yeah.
There's also Spellweaver Volute, that weird card I gave you once. It enchants an instant card in your graveyard, and whenever you cast a sorcery, you basically you exile the instant card, cast it for free, and then the aura moves onto a different instant in your graveyard.
Or a sorcery, I think.
No, I think it has
flip-flop
to be an instant.
It has to be an instant.
I'm going to look it up.
All
But while I do that, you explain what on earth Frenzy does.
Well, the one card that has it, it basically is Frenzy N. So N being a numerical value, so 1, 2, whatever. This sliver had Frenzy 1. So it said, whenever this creature attacks and isn't blocked, it gets +N+O till end of turn.
Oh.
So you were just incredibly incentivized to block this creature.
Right. How interesting.
The interesting thing about it as well is a sub-rule is if it has multiple instances of Frenzy, each trigger separately. So each of these Frenzy instances, so it's not like Toxic where it's intuitive and adds. It does it separately.
Oh.
Anyway, that's why that card only has one printing of it ever.
That one can stay in Future Sight and not ever be actually revealed to be future. I'd like to read out this weird card, by the way.
Spellweaver Volute.
Spellweaver Volute. For 3 blue, it's an aura. Enchant instant card in a graveyard.
Okay, so you were right.
Yep. Whenever you cast a sorcery spell, copy the enchanted instant card. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. If you do, exile the enchanted card and attach Spellweaver Volute to another instant card in a graveyard.
A graveyard? It doesn't have to be yours?
It doesn't have to be yours?
I think I might
that's
play
pretty
this
sick.
card. Okay.
Wow, I've never noticed that about the card.
Wow.
That makes it way better. You could play that in mill deck and just be like, cool, I'm going to cast your Swords to Plowshares. And once I've done that,
I'll choose the next best thing in the deck.
anything else.
You have to be running a reasonable amount of sorceries though to make it worthwhile, though, right?
Oh, because you have to cast
Yeah,
the sorcery.
you have to trigger it with
so
the
you'd have to be in a
sorcery.
Spellslinger deck.
Yeah,
I think.
for sure.
A Spellslinger deck that
With
cares
an
about
aura.
auras.
Okay, well look, without the Spellweaver Volute discussion,
Sure, yeah.
I hope you understand now that keywords, because you got the first couple right, because they were like
You got
reach.
4 or maybe 5,
You
right?
explained the difference between toxic and poison. I think you got 5.
Okay, yeah.
So 5 points is pretty good.
Yeah.
But like, one word, it turned you into a Russian spy. So like, it's not very intuitive to like, say one word and be like, that's what this card does.
Yeah.
You know?
In this instance, I think I see what you're getting at. Reading the card did not explain the card.
It didn't.
If I read a card and it said Frenzy 4, I'd be going, hey, James!
You'd turn into 4 copies of the Fonz.
No, it's not intuitive. It's not intuitive. And so if you're a new player and someone says, yeah, read the card, it'll explain the card, and you go, cool, I have no idea what this word signifies. Yeah, you're left in exactly the same spot you were before.
Yeah.
Except now you're a bit irritated because someone's been a bit of a dick.
Yeah, basically. But I think it's pretty easy with keywords on approaching this as a problem. Everyone's got a phone in their pocket that has access to Google these days.
Yeah.
I think the best way to find out is you can actually Google like reminder text of keyword abilities. And like, so for those that don't know, rule 207.2 is a rule about reminder text. So reminder text is not a rule. It is a summary to explain how the card works. I do have a bit of an interesting example with this that some Commander players might not be aware of that's super relevant to our format. Extort has reminder text where it references specifically...
This is very relevant to Commander. Yeah.
Exactly. It references specifically hybrid white and black mana. So if you're in a mono white Commander list, can you run Extort? Yes, you can.
Yeah, because it's in the reminder text.
Correct.
So it's like the only exception. You know, normally when people are talking about Commander color identity, they say, "Can you see any pips in the card in the rules text? If so, that's the color of the card." So you can have a mono white creature that's a 2/2, but if it says pay a red, it gains haste until end of turn. That's Boros for the purposes of Commander. It's a
Correct.
white red card. But yeah, not in this one weird case.
In these really small instances, rule 207.2 of the official document says, yeah, it's not an actual rule. But with these keywords, that summary, that like 3-sentence summary, I can imagine there's a lot of people at Wizards that put a lot of work into making that 10-word summary of this rule really well explain the card in a very short space of time.
Yeah.
So I would recommend, firstly, if you come across a keyword that you've never seen before, find the reminder text. It might be in a situation where you can find another card that has that reminder text on it. Like if you're in a draft, for example, often new abilities have reminder text on them in draft. But also section 702 of the comprehensive rule document, which by the way, we've linked in the show notes for you to download and have a look at. It's a ridiculously long document. I'm not saying read it all, but if you want to actually look through the whole list and read every single ruling and how it breaks down and if multiple instances of a keyword change it or all this kind of stuff, you can actually just Google the actual keyword and it will come up with the comprehensive rules. And reading the comprehensive rules will explain it.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. This is
100%.
also, by the way, a really good reason for new players, if you're getting someone else into the game and they're fairly new, this is a really good reason to buy them either a Commander Precon or a one of those starter decks, because what they will do is keywords that almost never get reminder text because everyone knows what they are, like lifelink, will actually have reminder text on them. So it's way easier to pick up the game because you're not assumed to know things like reach and things like lifelink. And the reason I know this, by the way, is because I always buy whatever like the cheapest printing of a card is on a website, and so much of the time it's the one from a precon or the one from like one of these things,
and it has the reminder
because
text
it has
on
the
it?
reminder text on it. And some people are like, I don't want to see that. Like, I know what lifelink does.
And Walt's like, no, I need to be reminded. Is it triggered or is it static?
I'm like, the reminder is not worth the 5-cent difference to me, so I'll take it.
The art is just fine.
Yes.
But there, I hope that kind of like gives you a little bit of an insight into keywords being a very annoying thing for this reading the card explains the card
Definitely.
kind of approach.
Yes. I think we should probably get to our second big thing we were looking at, though, which was cards with confusing wording.
Yeah.
Like cards that just straight up, you read them and you go like, oh, I kind of thought I knew what this card would do, and then I read it and I realized I was wrong.
Well, like, there are so many examples of this now in Commander, because, like, the thing about Commander as a format, it's meant to be quite big and explosive. And, like, where Commander came from was judges getting bored between rounds judging competitive Magic. So they decided to play the most complicated version of Magic there is, which is Commander.
Let's have all the cards in it at once.
And now when Wizards of the Coast realized, people like confusing shit. Here, have Wheel of Misfortune. There you go. Figure that out, you idiot.
Wheel of Misfortune is such a funny card because there's a world in which someone just explains to you what it does, and it's fine, but because the rules have to be worded a particular way, it can't say what it actually does on it. It has to say, you're going to read it.
I'm going to read it verbatim because it's such a bananas... It's literally a paragraph. It's insane.
Then let's take the time to explain how much simpler it actually is. Oh, my word.
All right, I'm going to read it like verbatim, like I do with the Thrifty Interlude.
Cool.
So, for 2 and a red, you get a sorcery. Here we go.
Cool.
Each player secretly chooses a number 0 or greater. Then all players reveal those numbers simultaneously and determine the highest and lowest numbers revealed this way. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose that number. Each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand and draws 7 cards. I nearly stumbled over that last sentence.
Yeah, there are far too many words on
horrific.
this card. Look, the gist of this card is someone casts it, okay? Do you want a wheel? That's the first question that you need to ask. Do you want to discard your hand and draw 7? If the answer is no, you always choose 0.
Yep.
If you choose 0, under no circumstances will you be wheeling your hand.
Or taking damage.
No, you won't take any damage. You won't be wheeling. You'll be totally fine.
Yeah.
If you do want to wheel, then this is basically the gambly kind of part of the card, and it says, how badly do you want to wheel? And do you think other players want to wheel?
Yeah.
Because if you think at least one player is happy with their hand, just bid like 1 life or 2. That'll be your secret number you choose. You might take the damage, you might not, but it'll only be a little bit, and then you get to wheel. But if you think lots of people want to wheel and everyone's going to be bidding, you should bid a bit higher because you don't want to have the lowest number because that person never wheels.
Correct.
So if you really need a new hand, you should choose a slightly higher number because you're much more likely to wheel away your hand and draw 7.
And a key thing here is everyone... So if, for example, Walt and I both go, right, we're going to bid 6 life, and both of us are the highest bidders, both Walt and I take 6 damage.
Yeah. What usually happens, though, most of the time, is someone desperately wants to wheel and is like, screw it, and chooses 10.
Wrong
or whatever.
choice.
And they are so likely to take that 10 damage. I think, really, like, when you see this card hit the field, be like, do you think there's anyone of your opponents who is likely to keep their hand? Because they're going to choose 0. You can just choose 1 then.
I will highlight, usually the person that's casting Wheel of Misfortune wants to wheel.
Yes.
So you can't kind of assess the situation. Look at them and be like, okay, they only have 1 more card left in hand. They're definitely going to want to wheel. If I literally choose 1, I wheel and don't take damage. But this card is not intuitive at all. This is so confusing.
Especially with how it's worded.
This is Wizards' secret way of reprinting Wheel of Fortune.
Which is on the reserve list.
Correct.
So Wizards of the Coast have said they'll never reprint that card. But yeah, Wheel of Fortune just says each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards, but that card is worth like $300 because it's on the reserve list. So yes, this was the best they could do. It's a good card. Like, I like it. I like what it actually does do to the game.
It's fun to play out.
It is, but it's not intuitive at all to read that card.
But like, there are a bunch of other cards that like have slabs of text on them, and you just look at it and go, that's much easier to explain if someone just like doesn't read the card and just explains how it works. Like, for example, Animate Dead.
Oh, God.
This is a really common one in Commander, though, because like you constantly see Graveyard Reanimator decks run this, because A, not too expensive cash-wise to pick up.
No.
B, cheap mana value to reanimate something from the graveyard.
Also does very weird things if you're like any sort of enchantment deck where you might be able to get that back from the graveyard to the battlefield.
Well, that's why it's worded like this. It says,
It's
1
so
and a
strange.
black for an enchantment aura that enchants a creature card in a graveyard, and then when Animate Dead enters the battlefield, if it's on the battlefield, it loses enchant creature in a graveyard and gains enchant creature put into the battlefield with Animate Dead. Returned enchanted creature card from the graveyard to the graveyard under your control and attach Animate Dead to it. When Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, this creature's controller sacrifices it. It also gets -1, -0 for some goddamn reason.
Oh, it's so bad.
It's really annoying. Like, okay,
It's so bad.
essentially, don't return this to the battlefield from the graveyard.
No, it'll
because
bend your brain.
It'll bend your brain.
Just think of it as reanimate that stays on the creature as
Correct.
an aura, and then think of that aura as saying, if this aura goes anywhere, the creature's dead.
Correct.
Right? Like, this is like a spell that's keeping the creature alive.
Yeah.
If we get rid of that spell that's keeping the creature alive because it was dead, it's just going to stay dead, it's dead forever, whatever. But yes, mostly just think of it as reanimate,
With extra steps.
With extra steps. And don't flicker it. I beg you,
Please.
do not make this aura leave the battlefield and then enter the battlefield or come from the battlefield. It bends your brain.
It's so stupid. But look, okay, so like when we're faced, and I'm thinking like as a player that's never encountered this before, so it might not be a new player, it might be a very experienced player, but it's just never encountered these like slabs of text cards.
Never seen Spellweaver Volute
Yes,
before.
that's another great example
Yes.
of this kind of card.
Yeah.
I think the first thing you should do is check to see if the card's text, like the literal card that you have in front of you, is that text up to date? And by up to date, I mean what's commonly known as the oracle text or
Yeah.
errated text.
Yes, so a lot of really old cards, if you just read them as they are written on the card, that's not actually what their rules text reads anymore.
For example, like killing a creature used to be called bury a creature.
Yes. Well, I think... Oh, that one might have some weird other connotations associated with it. I'm not
Really?
sure.
Oh, God.
I think
don't
it might
know.
put it somewhere in your graveyard because graveyard order used to matter.
Oh, God.
I think, anyway, there's so much weird
God.
stuff out there. But the other thing that can happen is... Oh my God, I've lost my train of thought.
With like errated rules text.
Yes, errata rule set. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to give another example of a really common errata, which because it only changed like 10 years ago, roughly, a little bit longer. The word play. So
Yeah.
they didn't used to write cast on things. So when like a spell like what's the creature that says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card?
Beast Whisperer.
Beast Whisperer.
Oh, Beast Caller. Beast Whisperer.
No, Beast Whisperer. You're right, yeah, Beast Whisperer. Yeah. Says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. That's its rules text. If that was printed 15 years ago, that would have said whenever you play a creature spell, draw a card. That got really confusing because people started going like, oh, what if I play a creature card from my hand onto the battlefield by putting it on the battlefield?
Yeah, what if I like tutor it from my library onto the battlefield?
Yeah, when am I casting a spell? When am I putting it on the library? I can't really tell. And so they changed all of that and just said, look, spells are when you cast them, and when something is put on the battlefield, it'll just say put on the battlefield, and play is kind of this weird hybrid thing that lets you play lands and stuff.
Casting is when you spend a cost to
Put it on the stack.
Put it on the stack. Yeah. It's really confusing, but like when you encounter one of these cards, and it could very well have a big like red flag on it, and by red flag I mean a big white border that says this was printed a long time ago.
Yeah, assume if you see a white border, you need to check the rules.
Yeah, just Google it. You can find this on Gatherer or Scryfall, which is our favorite place to go to.
Yeah, Scryfall has up-to-date Oracle text on the card. So when you look
I
up
am
on
currently
Scryfall,
on Scryfall
you're
right
on
now.
Scryfall right now. So when you're on Scryfall, it'll have the card up the top
As an image.
as an image. So that sometimes is right, but most of the time you have to scroll down, and there will be an actual section where it just reads the card, but the text on the card might be different because it'll have been updated, and that will be the most up-to-date version of the card.
And then very handy at the bottom of that page as well. You
on
can
Gatherer
also,
or Scryfall.
On
yeah.
Gatherer or Scryfall, we'll also have notes and rules information for the card you're looking at. So for example, Animate Dead has notes from 2016 on it that says like abilities such as Shroud and Protection function only this battlefield. You know, it tells you how it interacts with different cards and different abilities. And so if you have a really weird moment where you're like, oh, this card is confusingly worded and there's something else going on in the battlefield, you can go to Scryfall, have a look at the notes that, you know, has been made around those rulings and go, oh, that explains it.
Yeah.
It might even specifically reference the card that you're confused about.
So much of the time, if I encounter a weird interaction with a card and I go like, I wonder how that interacts with this kind of effect, like flickering or something like that.
Yeah.
If you go to the Scryfall or the Gatherer rulings, there will be a ruling because they know that players all think the same way about these things. And there might be a ruling that specifically says, if this is exiled and returned to the battlefield, this is what will happen. And you go, oh my God.
And sometimes it just explains, like, this is what happens. And then you go, I don't need to understand why. No. I'm just going to take this website's advice and be like, this is what happens.
So for reference, those rulings that appear there are either from competitive rulings, like when an actual event was on and a judge intervened and said, like, this is how this card's going to work.
Yep.
It's added to the card on there. Or more of the time, the card it's about to come out and the judges have a read of all the rules text, and they go, okay, we better just include 2 or 3 rulings here to be really clear about what happens when these common scenarios occur. And that's why when you go down, it'll have a timestamp. You saw that one.
Yeah, like 2016. This is when it happened.
Yes, probably a lot of the time the card will have like 4 rulings, and they'll all be from exactly the same date.
It'll be when judges conferenced and spoke about the cards.
Or just when the card was released. Even. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I think that these confusingly worded cards are actually... There's ways you can approach these cards that aren't just, I'm going to Google it real quick and figure it out. I think there's actually ways to read a card that we can kind of point you to that'll help you break down a card.
For sure.
I think breaking it down is actually quite a good way of explaining it. Remember when you were in primary school and you're learning how to read, and the teacher will be like, sound it out, break it down, make it into little parts. Magic rules are often broken into very distinct sections within a sentence, and it tells you how the card works if you understand how those sentence structures work.
For sure. There's even really simple ones like identifying an a triggered ability. All triggered abilities should, if they've got the correct text on them, start with either the words whenever, when, or at. And any card that has that on there is a triggered ability. Yep. So if you're trying to work out whether, when something is an ability, like if you can copy it with something that might say, like a Strionic Resonator, for instance.
Good example.
Says copy, target, activated, or triggered ability.
Yep.
You can identify a triggered ability because it will start with whenever, when, or at.
Yep.
And activated is similarly pretty easy to get your head around because activated means you'll have to pay a cost and then an effect will be put on the stack. So if something says, pay, like a lot of filter effects are like this. They'll say, pay 2 generic mana, add a mana of any color. Yeah,
there's actually a really easy way to identify activation costs as well. A lot of the time, the card will have a colon on the card that separates. The first part of the sentence is the cost. So say, for example, you have to pay 2 generic mana, so it'll have the 2 with the colorless, and then it will say, tap, and also sacrifice this permanent. It'll have all of that, and then a colon, and then it will say, gain 3 life.
Yep.
That's a food token.
Yes.
That's how a food token works.
So you have to do all of those costs that are on the left side of the colon in order to put the effect, everything on the right side of the colon, on the stack.
Correct.
So you can't skip ahead. You can't go like, I'll respond to the tapping of the artifact and do this thing to untap it. Nope. You can't do that.
It's gone now. You've sacrificed it.
Yep. All those effects have been paid at the same time.
Yeah. I think also like reading a card sentence by sentence actually goes a long way. Like, for example, the Wheel of Misfortune example. It is actually worded quite well in terms of managing to fit that entire explanation. I know I just shat on it, but like...
It's true. Like, it's worded the best way it possibly could
and the
be.
most succinct way. I think it's the most succinct way of wording it because it has to fit on a tiny little magic card.
Yeah, for sure.
I also think, like, there are people online that explain really complicated cards. I've actually got a card up as an example here. Have you ever heard of Chain of Mephistopheles?
Only in that I know it bends judges' brains when it's played.
Yeah. Shout out to Ellie who actually put me onto this card and sent me a flowchart for how it works.
A flowchart?
I'm not kidding. So,
oh my word.
Okay, I'll read the card and you can hear the card and then I'll show you the flowchart. I might link the flowchart in our show notes as well.
Sure.
But it's 1 and a black for an enchantment. And it says, if a player would draw a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, that player discards a card instead. If the player discards a card this way, they draw a card. If the player doesn't discard a card this way, they mill a card.
Oh my word.
Now, it sounds horrific, but look at this flowchart. It actually breaks down the card's ruling and it starts off with, if you would draw a card, move on. Is it your draw step? 2 ways to go. Yes or no. If you go down the yes route, there's another question. You go off each of those tangents.
Oh my word.
It makes it easier to understand. Look, I'm not going to spend all day talking about Chains of Mephistopheles, but if there is a card that you encounter that just clearly is confusing. Someone's probably made a flowchart of it online or like a graphic to explain how it works.
I don't know this for sure, but I would hazard a guess that Wheel of Misfortune has a flowchart out there somewhere. That probably says, like, it asks you, like what I did earlier of going, like, do you want a wheel? No, choose 0.
Yeah.
Yes, how badly do you
That's
want a
like
wheel?
how the best way to play Wheel of Misfortune flowchart.
Yeah.
I actually remember there was a Command Zone episode. I'm now struggling to remember the game notes where they actually had Josh explain it with some graphics and stuff. There is a Game Nights episode with that.
They made a bit of a joke though. They were like, it's much more confusing than like Josh is like, it's really simple. If you want to wheel, do this. If you don't want to wheel, do this. Or you could do this, or you could do this. And then it's like all up on the screen and Josh goes, okay, it's pretty confusing.
It's pretty confusing. But look, I'm going to kind of point to an example that I had recently with these confusingly worded cards.
Sure.
And I'm hopefully going to lead this into a section where we can talk about how to approach judges.
Oh, okay.
Because this is something that happened recently. I cast a card, and we've spoken about this on the podcast, actually.
Okay.
Dark Salvation. This is in my zombie tribal deck.
Okay.
You remember what it does?
Doesn't ring a bell immediately, yeah.
It's XX and a black for a sorcery.
Mm-hmm.
It says target player creates X/2/2 black zombie creature tokens.
Oh.
Then up to one target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each zombie that player controls. Now, that makes sense to me. I read that and go, I see what is happening on this card.
Sure, you pay X, so like let's say you pay 2 into X, so there's 2 X's in the cost, so you pay X twice. So if you want X to be 2, you've got to pay 5 mana in total.
Yep.
You're going to pay 2 generic, 2 generic, and a black.
Yep.
X equal to 2. Target player makes 2 zombie tokens, 2 2s. That's you.
I will target myself. I'll make 2 2s.
I'll make 2 2 2s. And then a creature gets -X/-X until end of turn where X is the number of zombies you control. This doesn't have to be 2 because you might have more zombies than the 2 that you just made. So you might then go like, okay, cool. That 5/5 over there, I've got 5 zombies here. That one's going to get -5/-5 until end of turn.
Correct.
Cool. That
That's
seems
how
great.
it works. However,
Oh.
I spoke about this on a podcast episode and got some direct messages about this card. And someone said to me that no, you have to give the zombies to the player in which the creature you're trying to destroy controls. So who's the player that controls the creature you want to kill? That's who you have to give the zombies to.
Okay.
And I was like, no, I don't think that's how it works. And because it says, anyway, we went back and forth because it says for each zombie that player controls.
It's not clear immediately who that player is.
Exactly. So this was one of those cards where I was pretty confused. Anyway,
Sure.
I'm not going to go on and on about this, but basically I took what this person said as truth. Anyway, recently I went camping with some mates and we were playing some Commander without any cell reception. And my friend was piloting my deck. Ben, actually. Shout out to Ben.
Who wins every game he plays.
Pretty much.
Against us anyway.
Against us, for sure. He cast the card and was like, I'm going to now kill this. And I went, actually, someone actually corrected me on the Discord, this isn't how it works. And Ben was like, no, I'm pretty sure this is how it works.
Right.
Of 2 differing opinions again. So I was like, okay, I need to approach a judge.
Okay.
I need to ask. So when I got back, I went online and I asked a judge how the card works. And it was confirmed by a judge that yes, you can target yourself to create the zombies and target someone else's creature to destroy it.
I think I realized in the process of you reading the card how you can work this out.
Yeah.
Targets, when you select them, if there's only one target for a spell, it always stays the same.
And if it refers to that target, it always refers to the target that you have declared.
Yes. So the spell begins with target player creates X zombies. So what it's saying is, yeah, you make all those zombies, and then you do the effect, and it's equal to the number of zombies that player controls. That player is the person who made the zombies, which in this case can be you. It doesn't tell you that the creature
of that
has to be a particular target player. That's not relevant to the card.
Yeah, if it was worded the other way, it would say something along the lines of target player creates X/2/2 zombies. Then target creature that player controls gets -X.
Yeah, there'd be lots more text on it for sure.
It would be a lot more confusing. But anyway,
I want to shout out one more thing about this card, by the way. That someone pointed out to me I've never realized before. You can pay X equal to 0.
I have done that multiple times.
And
with this card.
it's a 1 mana removal spell because it just says target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures target player controls.
Well, interestingly, you still have to target yourself. You go, I target myself to create 0 zombies, but I control 9 zombies. That creature gets -9.
Yeah.
Really cool card.
Really cool.
But look,
really cool.
I was so confused because I had so many people asking me different questions. And because I'm not a judge and no one in this conversation was a judge, I was like, right, I need to actually go and ask a judge a question.
I think that was the right call. Yeah.
I'm really glad I did. And thankfully it came out the way I wanted it to come out as well. But
I love when the ruling says you can do that in the way that's really good for you.
We hate it when it says, doesn't work the way you want it to.
Doesn't work the way you want it to, yeah.
But I thought it would probably be good for us before we take a little bit of a break to kind of just go over how to actually approach a judge and ask them a question, because it can be pretty intimidating. especially if you're in a game store, but also if you're utilizing our Discord, which, as we've said before, has judges. If you want to ask our judges a question, it's really easy to do, but we want to advise you to do some specific things and not other things. For example, please don't go into the Ask a Judge channel and just say, how does this card work? And then say a card.
Yeah, because
That's really vague.
You got to think of it from a judge's perspective. They have a wealth of different rulings to draw upon, a wealth of cards that you might be referring to and working with.
Yeah,
like they need to know the specifics of what the specific interactions are going to be, not how does it work.
Well, for example, Dark Salvation has 3 separate rules notes on that card alone.
Yeah.
So instead of explaining all 3 of those, the judge has to then ask you a question, being like, okay, what's the board state look like? What are you targeting? Who does... if I just said, how does Dark Salvation work?
Yeah. Not so helpful.
A judge would probably say, pay XX black, target player creates... it's not as intuitive as actually saying what you want answered.
Yeah, I think the answer to this and the way to go about it instead is exactly what the judge would do to you if you asked it in this way, which is... What do you mean? Be specific. What is the specific interaction you're looking at? If you can, name all the cards that are relevant. So if it's Dark Salvation is probably not such a good example because we just want to know how that specific card works. But if it was, you have something that says whenever you do this thing, this effect happens. And then you've got another thing that says whenever you do this other thing, this effect happens. Include both of those cards in your question. Don't go how does card A work with cards that do this kind of thing? Be like, no,
this card and this card.
Yeah.
How do these two interact with this on the stack?
Yeah, really specifically. I have this on the battlefield. I'm putting this on the stack. What happens? That is way easier to answer.
Even saying how you understand it is actually not a bad way to approach it. Like saying, I think that these 2 cards interact like this, and this is why I think that. Am I right?
Yeah.
A judge can really easily be like, yes.
Yeah.
And then you're like, cool, nailed it. Also, I feel like a genius.
Way less effort for the judge, right? They can just read through it and go, does that make sense? Yeah, I think it does. Yes. That's the single word reply that is needed there.
And then if it is a no, then they can give you all the information you need.
Exactly.
But even saying things like, my opponent controls card name and I cast this. Do I get this? Actually sounding out. I know it sounds like we're speaking to primary school kids, but actually sound out what you want answered.
Yeah.
I think approaching it really bluntly of how does this work? Do I get this? It doesn't actually give the judge enough to work on.
No, and you're also potentially going to get the wrong answer. If you include every relevant part of the problem, then you're much likely to get the correct answer. Because if you have someone has some sort of spell that says damage that would be dealt to you is prevented, and you don't include that when you ask if you can cast Comet Storm where X is equal to 10 and copy it 4 times and deal 40 to each of your opponents, then the answer that you get where the judge says, yeah, that'll work, that's actually going to be wrong because someone controls something that stops that from happening. Yeah.
And look, in a game store, when you're at a game store, it's not rude to put your hand up and just kind of yell judge. It is actually, judges attuned to that because they're used to having a big event where lots of people are there.
Yeah.
So if you're in a game store, if you're at a game store with Walt and I, you can just throw your hand up and yell judge.
You definitely can. I'll say as well, specifically when you're asking questions on our Discord, we have a Discord bot that can pull the card and the rulings
The
through
Scryfall bot.
The Scryfall bot. If you write the card name with 2 square brackets on either side, so let's say you're typing in Dark Salvation. If you go square bracket, Dark Salvation, close square brackets, close square bracket, when you hit enter on that message, a Scryfall bot will go, cool, and grab Dark Salvation, all of the text on the card, post it in the channel, makes the way faster for the judge to answer the question because they have all the relevant information right in front of them.
And keep in mind, our judges in our Discord volunteer their time to do this. If we can end this section on thank God for judges.
Yeah.
I think really you guys, and I know that the judges in our Discord do occasionally listen to this podcast and probably this episode.
Yes.
thank you for the
Yeah.
service that you provide.
Seriously.
We have, and all of our listeners now get the opportunity to utilize your incredible services. And, hopefully this episode can help the work that you do be easier, because we know that sometimes getting questions can be really complicated or really hard and takes time for you to answer out of your own day. So, all the listeners, our judges are really, really special. Let's help them answer our complicated rules questions as best we can.
Yeah, and we really appreciate you for it.
Yeah.
Now, we've been talking for quite a while, so
I knew this would be a big one.
I think it's time for a thrifty interlude. So we obviously have lots left to cover. We still have that big last section of complex magic rules. And I think also probably a discussion about how we should just go about rules in general.
Making rulings,
rulings and especially making rules without judges, which is iffy, but we'll go into that later. So before that, though, we're going to hear a little something about a thrifty card. So this week, I will be bringing this card to life in monologue form. So this will be from the perspective of the card. So would you like to let us know which creature I'll be bringing to life this week, James?
And if you are a long-time listener of the podcast, you'll know this card. Yeah. And if you've ever played Walt's Selesnya artifacts list, yes, that is something that can exist. You might be familiar with Glunch the Bestower. For 1 green and a white, you'll get a legendary creature, Jellyfish, that's a 0/5, has flying, and reads, at the beginning of your end step, choose a player. They put 2+1 counters on a creature they control. Choose a second player to draw a card. Then choose a third player to create 2 treasure tokens. Wobbly, wobbly, wobbly. Humana, lamina, go.
Now that's exactly what you expected me to say, isn't it? Hi, I'm Glunch, the Bestower, and since I was born last year, I've been known by many other names. Silly, squishy, confusing, or even the precious little baby. These are all cunning distractions from the fact that I am a jellyfish, and I can speak the human language of English. So what are the right words to say? How about Glunch? Where did you learn to speak English? You could also try, where are your lips, tongue, cheeks, and mouth? Or even, are you a single organism or a collection of organisms arrayed in a symbiotic conglomerate, like a Portuguese man-of-war? So next time you see a jellyfish, stop and think. Do I really know what I'm getting into?
Oh, walla koala moustache! Get budgeted! Why is Glunch like some neutral American Tom Hanks American accent?
If I find out, I'll let you know.
Okay. As no one, the oobly woobly goobly bit, I was like, that's what Glunch sounds like. I actually, while we're on the topic of rules, I noticed that this card is kind of confusing to read because it has multiple targets. I've got a question. Does it, when you choose... because it says choose a third player. What if it's just you and someone else left?
This is really interesting because you have to choose them in order and you can't... It says third player and second player. It doesn't say choose a player and then it would say choose a player, choose a player. That would let you choose the same mode twice or something. You actually, once there are only 2 players in the game, you can only choose the first and the second mode. So you can't ever create 2 treasure tokens.
Oh, but that's why it's such a sleeper agent in your deck, is because you run this in your Ishtakik deck.
Yes.
So when an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield on anyone's board,
yes,
you put a +1 counters on all the golem you control.
So you always give the treasures to someone else, basically.
It's really cool.
You can have the treasures. Most of the time, what I'll do is I'll give someone who has meaningless creatures 2 counters. I'll draw a card in my end step, seems good.
Win.
And give anyone else 2 treasure tokens and be like, go nuts. Crack 'em, I dare you.
This feels really cool.
It's a cool one. If you'd like to see these weird things that I write in text form, they're released every Thursday on our Thrifty Thursdays channel in our Discord server, which is linked in the show notes. And you can also see us bring some of these to life in video form over on TikTok at Get Commanded. So follow us on there if you'd like to see those as videos.
All right. Well, I was about to say back to the main topic, but we managed to turn the thrifty interlude into the topic.
That's true.
But we're talking about complex rules and all that kind of stuff. Now, we talked about keywords, we talked about confusing wording, but There are rules in Magic the Gathering's 280 plus page document
Yes.
that are just so like wordy and like long and complex that you won't know how they work, but you know how they play out in the game.
Yeah.
But sometimes cards will interact with those rules. This is again another reason why sometimes saying read the card explains the card doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing we'll go into as well is there are cards that are worded very like short. Like they're not complicated wording like we did in the last topic. They're short cards, but the way they play out is very complicated because of the way they affect a card. And I'm sure we're going to talk about layers, which everything gets funny when you start talking about layers.
An ogre has layers. An onion has layers. Magic the Gathering has layers.
What about cake? Everyone loves cake.
Wedding cakes have layers.
Yes,
Technically.
that's true.
Look, yeah, there are a lot of rules that are like incredibly complicated, and I remember the moment when I looked at this transmission and was like, oh my god, we're going to have to talk about these things, aren't we? And this is why I approached one of our judges, because I wanted to approach a couple of them. One of the ones that I wanted to approach was replacement and prevention effects.
Yeah, this stuff gets really iffy. And speaking of like reading the card, explaining the card, sometimes replacement effects straight up change what the card says.
Yes.
Like the card straight up doesn't say, like you can read the card in front of you and go like, cool, this is what it does. And
But
it's like,
someone else controls a card that says, no.
It doesn't do that. And now your card doesn't say that on it anymore.
Yeah. Well, this is the crazy thing. Like, you just hear the word replacement and prevention. This is how they're worded as, it's rules 614 and 615 in the comprehensive rules document. But prevention means I'm preventing this from happening. I'm stopping it from happening. And replacement means I'm taking this thing and replacing it with something else. So once you understand that concept, these rules start to become a little bit more apparent in how they work and how they behave. But there's so many different ways this can happen in a game of Commander that why don't we just dive into rule 614.1a.
Sure. I imagine you got this prepared.
I've got it up here because
Okay, sure.
I downloaded the entire document and it's taking up an incredible amount of space on my phone. But look, so like rule 614 is about the replacement continuous effects. So they're often called like continuous effects. So things that happen all the time. So this is a subsection of that. So like an enchantment, for example, that says all creatures get +1/+1. That's a continuous effect. That's always happening.
It's not like an instant or sorcery that does it temporarily.
Correct.
Or even like something you can activate to make it happen temporarily. This is something that just stays on the battlefield and says, this is just what it's going to happen.
Yes, but the subsection of this is where a permanent continuing effect changes the way other things work. I'll give you an example. So if we're looking at replacement effects, so this is rule 614, we can look at cards that, I'll read the rule verbatim, that says effects that would use the word instead are a replacement effect. Most replacement effects use the word instead to indicate what events will be replaced with other events. So my first example of this instantly popped to mind was Notion Thief, a Commander staple.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you think about the card that got banned, Hull Breacher, which was similar to this, but even worse.
Which we talked about in very deep detail in our ban list episode.
Yeah.
But yes, this straight up says, if a player would draw a card, instead you draw 2 cards?
You're super close.
Okay.
So it says, if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, instead, that player skips that draw and you draw a card. So you can see where the word instead is. It literally separates. It's in a similar way we had the colon affecting the cost and the effect, like separating those two sides.
Yeah.
In these instances, the word instead can behave like our colon and say everything before the instead is what could happen.
This is what it's checking for. This is like, if it's like a detective, they're looking for everything before that instead word, and then everything after the instead is what they're going to do when they find it.
Correct. So Notion Thief is really cool thematically when you think about this on a card. The thief, like, looking for someone trying to draw a card.
Yes.
And then instead of them drawing,
you're
going to draw it.
You draw the cards instead. Yeah. Cool.
So there's one example, but
Sure.
there are other examples that say skip for example. So this is
Okay.
rule 614.1b. So see, there's a whole subsection to the subsection of the subsection of this rules document that we're going into.
Yep.
So this one is saying the word skip. So anything that says skip on it is also a replacement effect. And this basically replaces that thing that it wants to skip with nothing.
Right.
So instead of you drawing, I draw, you just go, you skip it.
Yes.
So a good example of this, for example, is Stasis. This
Right.
is a card that everyone is terrified of. It's a pretty brutal stacks card.
Mm-hmm.
1 and a blue for an enchantment that says players skip their untap steps.
So it's not replacing the untap step with anything. It's just saying instead of an untap happening, it's skipped.
Yes, it
happens.
replaces it with nothing. So you
Cool.
still move through the phase, but it just moves through it. It's not
Yeah.
like anything's happening in it.
Sure.
So, for example, Bontu's Last Reckoning kind of looks like a card that says skip,
Okay.
but it doesn't quite. So, Bontu's Last Reckoning, for context, is 1 black and a black for a sorcery that says destroy all creatures, which is pretty sick for a rate on a board wipe.
Mm-hmm.
But it then says lands you control don't untap during your next untap step.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a thing that goes on like a delayed
trigger, they call this, right?
I'm not sure if this is a delayed trigger. I'm going to
Okay.
have to check if this is an example of a delayed trigger, but
Sure.
this is basically saying just your lands don't untap. You still go through your untap step.
Oh, it's not skipping anything.
It's not skipping anything. So that's
Right.
like Stasis is an example of this skipping effect, but Bontu's Last Reckoning is just saying your lands don't untap.
Sure. We also see this sometimes. Oh no, I'm not going to have a crack at it. I was going to try and guess one, and then I was like, that doesn't have the word skip on it. I don't want to confuse this. We got so much ready. I can see that James has already got.
Well, I also
correct.
checked these with judges.
I don't want to throw extra things in here that are going to be wrong. So yes, please, the next one,
Well,
James.
here's one that you'll be familiar with because it's +1 counters and mono green.
Heyo.
This is where effects that read this permanent, so a creature, enters the battlefield with, or as this enters the battlefield, or this permanent enters the battlefield as. These are all replacement effects. So instead of, for example, something triggering something to happen when it enters the battlefield, it enters as that thing or with the thing. So, for example, I use the +1 counter example because you're familiar with these in your Mowu deck.
Very much.
So Renata, Called to the Hunt, is a great example of this.
Yep.
It's a legendary enchantment creature demigod that says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1 counter on it.
So importantly, this is not a trigger. This doesn't say when creatures you control enter the battlefield, put a +1 counter on them. That would be a trigger on the stack that could be responded to, that could be interacted with in that way. Creatures are entering as.
Yes.
With the +1 counter on them, or entering with the +1 counter. So this is a replacement effect for that.
Well,
occurring.
a great example of the triggered effect is like Great Henge. That says
Right.
whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1 counter on it.
Yes, so this
and
is
you
a
can
trigger.
draw a card, which is stupid.
Yeah, it is ridiculous.
But I'll give you an example where this is super relevant to rules. Say someone controls an Elish Norn. The Elish Norn that gives everything -2/-2, and all of your creatures +1.
Two,
plus
two.
2, plus
Yeah.
2. Say you're casting a 2/2. As it enters the battlefield, if it's entering with a +1 counter and it becomes a 3/3, it will live.
Yeah.
But if it enters with like the Great Henge on the battlefield, for example, it's going to die before
the trigger could put a +1 counter on it.
Exactly.
Right.
So-
Super interesting.
So that's where it can become really, really relevant to know as things enter, it's entering as this.
Yeah.
That's one word that I pick up on. It enters as this, as, yeah.
There's also a really important opportunity to respond that is not happening with the replacement effect. So, for instance, if you had a 3/3 creature that you were casting, so say Mowu, right? Mowu is a 3/3 with Trample and Vigilance. If I was casting Mowu, and you James, had a Lightning Bolt in hand, if I had Great Henge, I can cast Mowu. Mowu enters the battlefield. The trigger goes on the stack.
For him to get a +1 counter.
You can respond, cast Lightning Bolt. Mowu is dead before the counter can be put on him. However,
With Renata.
I can cast Mowu. He enters the battlefield with that +1 counter on him. In this case, very interesting. His replacement effect will mean he enters the battlefield with 2 +1 counters. But regardless, he's entering as either a 4/4 or a 5/5. You can cast Lightning Bolt if you would like. as a response to
him entering the battlefield
or me doing
a
something
trigger,
else. But at that point, he's big enough to survive the lightning bolt.
There you go. These are the things in these rules that, like, if you were reading the card, doesn't explain it.
Yeah.
There's nowhere on that card that says, if you want to cast your lightning bolt now, do it at this precise moment.
It's true. You've got to have a little bit of implied understanding.
Yeah.
But I think this is a really good one of just looking out for the specific words that begin those sentences. You know, does it say as this enters the battlefield, or does it say when this enters the battlefield?
Or this permanent enters the battlefield as.
Yeah.
For example, that's like clone effects can enter the battlefield as. And one of my favorite ways to interact with this rule is one of my favorite cards of all time, Mystic Reflection.
Oh, this weird thing from Kaldheim.
Yeah.
This is like the one you can foretell for 2 generic and then it costs a blue. Or it's just 1 and a blue as an instant.
Yes.
And I'm going to guess the text and you can tell me if I'm right. The next time 1 or more creatures would enter the battlefield this turn, they instead enter the battlefield as a copy of target non-legendary creature.
You are so close.
Okay.
Firstly, the first thing it says is choose target non-legendary creature.
Oh, so you choose
that's
that
at the first.
Okay, sure.
But it's also the next time 1 or more creatures or planeswalkers. It also hits planeswalkers.
But yeah, this is basically
So someone could cast a Teferi and you're like, no, it's a 1/1 plane.
Yep. This is definitely an example of that enters as kind of thing, right? So, yeah, the creatures aren't entering the battlefield and then as a trigger becoming something else. They're entering the battlefield as that non-legendary creature you chose as part of the spell being cast. So, yeah, there's no time in there that you can interact and go like, I'm going to respond by doing this. It's like, no, the creatures have entered as that thing.
Correct. And so, like, for example, if you cast a Dockside Extortionist and someone Mystic Reflections it enters as whatever they chose for it to enter as, which means the Dockside trigger doesn't happen.
No,
it doesn't enter as Dockside.
No, it entered as something else, so there's no when this creature enters the battlefield written on the card.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that anymore.
Mystic Reflection is the biggest brain play against a Dockside.
You got to think really hard about when you're going to respond with Mystic Reflection, which I like.
It's a good card. But
it's a cool card.
Another effect that's a continuous effect that replaces something is a replacement effect that, like, has an effect on how other things enter the battlefield. So, for example, like this, cards that read permanents enter the battlefield, or these objects specifically enter the battlefield as, or with, or tapped, or something like these. These are also replacement effects. So good examples of this would be like Authority of the Consoles.
Oh, this is that like 1-mana enchantment that says creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped.
Yep.
And then when they enter the battlefield, you gain a life. That one's a trigger.
That's a trigger.
That's a triggered ability. But this that first one just says they enter tapped. So they're not entering and then becoming tapped. They're just entering tapped.
Correct. So it enters tapped, meaning it doesn't enter and then tap. It enters the battlefield tapped, which can be important because, for example, Amulet of Vigor is a card that kind of makes you go, does this replace everything that comes in tapped under my control as untapped? No, it doesn't. Amulet of Vigor is a 1-cost generic artifact that says whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped under your control, untap it.
Whenever is the key word here.
There
this
we go.
one is a trigger. So they will actually, you play your bounce land, your Azorius Chancery. It's going to enter the battlefield tapped. And then Amulet of Vigor is going to say, cool, I see that enter the battlefield tapped. It's going to untap now as a trigger on the stack.
So, for example, if you control an Amulet of Vigor and I control an Authority of the Consoles and you cast a creature, it'll enter the battlefield tapped because of Authority of the Consoles.
Oh, an Amulet of Vigor is going to untap it. It's going to put a trigger on the stack above that. Well, not above it because there's nothing on the stack. Oh, it's so confusing, but cool.
It's wild, right?
Yeah.
Now, another replacement effect that I do not want to talk about because it deserves its own episode is effects that read as this permanent is turned face up.
Oh.
So these are all replacement effects as well. Morphs are creatures that you can you can have them enter the battlefield face down, and then you can use a special action which doesn't exist commonly in Commander. Playing a land is a special action, pre-game actions are special actions, but then when you flip it, it replaces an effect, or it can be a replacement effect. It could be a triggered or activated ability, but it can also be a replacement effect. I don't want to talk about this anymore.
So weird, because there's so many morphs that say when this permanent is turned face up. That one goes on the stack. That starts with the word when, or as. These are like Oh no,
As is the replacement effect.
That's the replacement effect. But there are ones like Willbender.
Yes.
When this is turned face up, do this thing. That's a
Yes.
trigger. But yeah, morphs themselves, the flipping of the morph doesn't use the stack. That's a special action.
It's so
You can
confusing.
take it at any time you have priority, but it's not a trigger that goes on the stack. So you don't have any time at which you can go like, okay, before the morph flips, I'm going to do this. Nope, it's already up.
It's already up. You can't bolt the 2/2 in response.
No,
it's
let's
really
not talk about
confusing.
morphs.
So they're all replacement effects. There are
Sure.
also prevention effects.
Right.
So these are things that like could be continuous, like replacement effects, but prevention effects apply continuously as events happen. They aren't locked in ahead of time.
Right.
So this is, we're getting into some nitty gritty bit here. So sometimes, basically my advice for handling prevention effects is think about it as like it's acting like a shield around whatever it's affecting.
Right.
The thing will try and happen, but you're preventing it so it will have never happened. It's really, really weird to get your head around. But one of the things that I'm going to advise you to do when you're looking at prevention effects is first step is ensure to identify the exact thing that is being prevented. For example, commonly we'll see things like combat damage or non-combat damage being prevented.
Yeah, well, we see a lot of fogs in our format.
Yeah,
So
like Spore Frog.
Yeah, Spore Frog's a really good one. Just says prevent all combat damage that we dealt this turn. Children of Chorus does the same thing.
Yep.
Then you have like other weird ones that like prevent it and then do something, but they're preventing it first. So I imagine they're falling under this camp. Like a card I absolutely love, Ink Shield. Prevents all combat damage that we dealt this turn, and then you make a number of Inklings equal to the amount that was prevented.
So then something else I would recommend identifying is the exact thing that's being prevented. So is it exactly just combat damage? Is it all damage? Or is it non-combat damage?
They usually will say, right? It'll say prevent all combat damage, or it'll say prevent all non-combat damage, or sometimes they just say prevent all damage that will be dealt this turn. Yeah.
Then identify from how many sources. So is it saying from all, from one color, from one permanent, from one spell source?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really identify what it's preventing, where it's coming from, and then finally basically just how long is this prevention happening?
Sure.
Because it could be a continuous on the battlefield, maybe an enchantment that says prevent all damage that would be dealt to you or something like that. Or is it a spell that you put on the stack that says until end of turn?
Yeah, or a lot of the ones that we see a lot as like answers will say prevent all damage that would be dealt by a target spell. Or some of the older effects will say by any one source, for instance. So yeah, like Deflecting Palm is a response for a very specific source that's dealing damage to you.
It's an incredible response.
It's really, really good, but it's going to prevent that one specific instance, right? It's not saying prevent all damage that we dealt to you this turn. That would be a really different effect to what Deflecting Palm says, which is you're choosing that one source, that's being prevented, and then you're going to do this thing.
Yeah, and I think the final thing to think about with prevention effects is when you prevent something from happening, it doesn't happen. I know that sounds dumb, but say, for example, you've got a creature that has a combat damage trigger. So whenever this creature deals combat damage,
Draw a card.
Draw a card.
Yeah.
That's a good one. If that combat damage gets prevented, it doesn't deal the combat damage, meaning you don't draw a card.
Yeah, the damage was never done.
It was never done. It's like, I kind of envision like prevention effects by like putting a bowl around a spider in the living room, being like, well, it's not going anywhere now and it's not happening. Can't bite me if it's under a bowl.
Yeah. You can also see, I think, the relevance here of why they lump these with those replacement effects, because it's kind of like that effect we talked about before that replaces an event with nothing.
With nothing.
You know, it's preventing the instance of combat damage being dealt with nothing.
Nothing.
And so, yeah, if no combat damage is dealt, that effect is replaced with nothing,
Yep.
then yeah, the trigger can't happen because it never happened in the first place.
Now, I think we can go even deeper on this.
Oh, no.
Because I know, this is the section that I was fearing as well. But
Sure.
when you have continuous effects ongoing,
Yeah.
sometimes those interact with each other. And then we get into a section of the rules document that's, by the way, Rule 613, if you want to read it all, of interaction of continuous effects. And 613.1 identifies a part of Magic the Gathering's rule set that can make a lot of beginner judges scream, cry, and beginner players just never want to play the game. Layering.
Yeah.
So this is a really really in-depth section. What I'll do is I'll try and kind of blast through this super quick so we
Sure.
can just go through and kind of get a general understanding of how it works.
Yes.
But this is basically the layers of Magic the Gathering happening all at once, but not resolving because it's not using the stack. It is
apply
applied
them
in a very particular order.
Yeah, and this is why they're in separate layers, is so that you can identify the order that things should happen in. And we'll identify in a second why it's so important, especially when we get towards the bottom of those layers.
Layer 7.
Yeah, layer 7.
Oh, by the way, there's 7 layers.
There
Strap
are
in.
7. If they happened in a different order, we would end up with a really different end result.
Yes.
And it would be much harder, actually, to work out what happened. So it's really important that things sit in separate layers, because when things sit in the same layer, then you start talking about timestamps, which is how long has this thing been applying on the battlefield or in
and
this
whichever
zone?
one came in last has the last say.
That one is way more confusing than layering. So it's actually it's much easier to identify what the end result is of a few different things interacting when they sit in separate layers, because you can go, actually, we first apply these layers and then these ones, and at the end we have this.
That's our result. So, okay, let's dig into it.
Let's do it.
Layer 1. So this is the first top layer that we apply, and this is any rules and effects that modify copyable variables are applied.
Sure.
So anything a clone can copy, that's what's going to be applied first. That's the top layer.
Yep.
Then we go into the layer 2, which is control changing effects are applied.
So this is cards that say, like, gain control of target creature, or gain control of target permanent, or sometimes there's like
Exchange
auras.
control of target permanence,
Yeah.
which is another, I love role reversal. That's a good card.
But yes, this is an important one to apply early, so you know who actually has the thing that you're talking about.
Correct. So then once we've applied that, we go into layer 3, which is any effects that change the text of a card.
Thankfully, we don't have very many of these. You'll see a lot of them when you start playing against Orvar in particular, because you can start doing really strange things. And most importantly, a lot of these cards say target permanent on them. So with an Orvar deck, you just copy that permanent when you cast the spell. But yes, thankfully you don't see a lot of these in Commander, but when you do, it can get confusing.
Weirdly, I think I actually called out a couple of cards like Magical Hack in the Philosophy of Blue episode that we just did.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of these cards are blue. But for example, one of these cards that interacts with changing text could be a card like Trait Doctoring, which for a single blue as a sorcery, you get change the text of target permanent by replacing all instances of one color word with another one, or basic land type with another until end of turn.
Sure. So you can target a creature that says protection from white on it, for instance, and you can change the text on that card that says protection from white and make it say protection from red until end of turn. That's something you could do. Or, if it had a land on it that said, like, let's say High Tide. Says... Oh, yeah, anyway, we'll have a crack at this. High Tide says whenever you tap an island for mana, it adds an additional... It adds blue to the number of islands you control. It adds additional blue.
Additional blue.
You could target your forest and change it so instead it said island on it. And then you can tap that forest that now says island, and High Tide will say, that adds an extra blue now.
Or I also believe you can interact with land walk, basic land walk here. So if someone swings at you with like an island walker and you have islands, you can change it to have forest walk.
Oh, and then suddenly you'd be able to block it.
Yes.
That's interesting.
There's some really... I'm going to hedge my bets on that one and say I'm going to confirm with the judge.
That sounds right to me, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that's layer 3, is we're changing the actual text of the bloody cards we're using.
Again, thankfully that one is rarely relevant.
Yes, and it's applied early. Layer 4 is type changing effects. So this includes like changing the middle. So when you got a magic card, the middle bar where it says creature and creature type, or land type, or even planeswalker type, artifact type. If you're changing that, then this is where that's applied. So for example, if you, tap a Liquimetal Talk and turn something into an artifact, this is where that is being applied.
This was also where you would apply an effect like, what's that one that sees play? Mycosynth Lattice.
Oh, God.
All permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types, or instead of their other types. So yes, this would be applied here, I believe.
And then in layer 5, we get color changing effects. So, for example, you can have a card that says target permanent becomes blue until end of turn. So you're probably now thinking, wait, hang on, Trait Doctoring says you can change the color of something, but that's changing the text, not the actual color of the card.
Right. You're changing you might change the word that has color in it.
Yes.
But it's not saying this card becomes red
blue.
or becomes green.
Yes.
It's just saying change that word that says red until it says green.
Yeah. So for example, Liquid Metal Talk changes a type. Amoeboid Changeling says tap target creature or creature tap the Amoeboid Changeling, and then target creature gains all creature types till end of turn.
Right.
So that changes the type of a creature. So that's in layer 4 there.
Yeah.
So let's go further down in layer 6.
Mm-hmm.
Ability adding effects or keyword counters, ability removing effects, or effects that say an object can't have something are applied here.
This is the classic example of that rule that you hear a lot, especially when you're getting into Magic, which is that a can't always beats a can.
Yes.
So obviously in the previous layers, we might be giving something the ability to do something, possibly. Yep. But in this layer, it's going to say, let's say archetype of imagination.
That's all your creatures have flying, your opponent's creatures can't have flying.
Yes, so this would actually remove that flying ability now in this layer of the
So if you,
ability.
for example, if you had a creature that had a equipment that says equipped creature gains flying. If I then cast Archetype of Imagination, your creature will lose flying because we've applied those words already, and now we're removing them in layer 6.
Ooh, gets wacky down here, that's for sure.
And now we're into the belly of the beast,
Yeah.
which is layer 7, and this is where we finally start doing power and toughness changing effects. Now, I want to call out the fact that this layer has 5 sub-layers. I'm not going to go into them all because we are just getting a basic understanding of what we're doing here.
Sure.
But generally, this is the final layer of where things happen and where things are applied. And I love using Tarmogoyf and Lightning Bolt as an example for this.
This is really interesting because this is also something that was relevant during Pro Tours when both of these cards were legal at the same time. So I think that the usual example that's given, right, is that Tarmogoyf is a 2/3 in this instance because Tarmogoyf's power is equal to the number of card types among cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1.
Correct.
So if there's a creature in a graveyard right now, then Tarmogoyf, and that's the only type, card type in a graveyard, Tarmogoyf will be a 2... No, there's going to be 2 card types. Let's say there's a creature and enchantment in the graveyards at the moment. Tarmogoyf is a 2/3 because it can see 2 card types. So it's got that 2 on the first one, 3 because of the plus 1 as the toughness. And you attempt to cast Lightning Bolt on the Tarmogoyf. And you go, cool, I'm going to deal 3 damage to Tarmogoyf.
It's got 3 toughness. It'll die.
Nope.
Wrong!
Because as these effects are being applied, and this is before state-based actions are checked, like sending creatures to the graveyard that have taken lethal combat damage or lethal damage.
Yep.
Before that happens, layer 7 is going to apply and go, actually, there's an instant in the graveyard.
Tarmogoyf's power of toughness goes up by 1.
So by the time the state-based actions are checked and the game goes, cool, is anything going to die? It goes, nope. Tarmogoyf has actually got 1 more toughness now. It'll live. And the Tarmogoyf is 1 bigger now. So don't bolt the 2/3 Tarmogoyf unless there's already an instant in a graveyard.
Correct. It's a big learning curve that you'll never make that mistake twice.
Oh, so strange.
When I think of this example, I get a really funny mental image. Have you ever seen the chicken battle between Peter Griffin and the chicken from Family Guy?
Yes.
You know at the end of all those scenes where the chicken looks like it's dead and then it dun dun dun, it opens its eyes again.
That's the Tarmogoyf.
That's Tarmogoyf. As layer 7 is applied, it's opening its eyes like, I'm still alive.
I'm still alive. I'm ready for the next battle. Yeah. There's also a really good reason why power and toughness changing effects are applied down here. And why one of the last sub-layers is power toughness switches, where you exchange something's power and toughness.
There are cards that see play in Commander. I know because I used to play them.
Yep. They basically just straight up switch the power and toughness of a card. Let's say you have... This is a classic example of the rule I've talked about a few times that I applied. This is not a rule in Magic's game. This is a rule that I have in my mind when I'm trying to work out how something works.
How you approach
How I approach working out if a rule works is I ask myself, okay, if I was trying to break... If this rule worked the way that I think it might, how broken would the game be? And the answer here...
What other busted stuff could I do?
Yeah, straight up. The answer here with exchanging power toughness is, let's say I have a creature, right? And it's a 2/3. And I cast Giant Growth on it. Oh, that's a bad example. I cast a spell that gives it +2/+0 until end of turn.
Sure.
It's a 4/3. I exchange its power and toughness.
Now it's
right?
a 3/4.
It's a 3/4. And then I cast that spell again to make it a 5/4. And then I swap the power toughness back and it's a 4/5. And then I do any number of other things, right? Let's say that I go to combat, someone blocks, and they're like, cool, that'll die. And I go, actually, no, I exchange the power and toughness to the point where it would live. If a judge comes over to make a ruling on how this thing works, there are events that have occurred that cannot be walked back to.
Well, not proven walk
They
back
can't be
to.
proven.
Yeah.
There's no effect on a card that's occurred. There's an effect on a card, but you can't go like, okay, this card's in the graveyard, or the stack looked like this, because you have to trust that one of those players was correct about their interpretation of what happened.
Yeah.
Not a good situation to end up in, and you can't walk back and go what the actual power and toughness is unless you do all those pump effects first, and at the very end, you exchange the power and toughness, because now you can walk back and go, actually, when we apply these 5 cards, and then swap the power and toughness, we know where we end up, we're good.
Yeah, so for example, if you have like a bunch of continuous power and toughness changes, like, you know, all creatures you control get +1/+1, all creatures you control get +2/+0.
Yeah.
All of those have to be applied first before you switch the power and toughness, because otherwise it just isn't provable.
That are really difficult to walk back from. Yeah.
So look, these kind of really complex rules interactions can lead to really confusing situations, like you just outlined. Like, for example, another one I've come across a couple of times is what happens when you control a Blood Moon, but your opponent controls an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth.
Okay, so... Oh, this is so ridiculous. So Blood Moon is a 3-mana enchantment for 2 and a red that says all non-basic lands are mountains.
Correct.
That's straight up what it says, and it's capital M mountains because it's basically saying they have no types, blah, blah, blah,
They're
blah.
just mountain.
They just tap for red mana,
Your
that's
basic
it.
mountain.
Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth says all other lands... all lands are swamps in addition to their other types. So they all produce black extra, and it applies to your opponent's land. So yeah, I can see...
So these are 2 continuous effects that are changing the type of a card. Now, you mentioned before when that happens, we look at timestamps.
Which one of these has been on the battlefield longer?
Yeah. Now, look, you're going in the right direction because they're on the same layer. We're looking at timestamps, but you're wrong.
Oh.
This example specifically happens on what's known as a dependency clause.
Okay.
So a dependency is when something is relying on something else. That's the definition of a dependency. And in this situation, Blood Moon is affecting Urborg, but Urborg is not affecting Blood Moon.
Right, because Urborg doesn't say, like, enchantments are swamps or anything like that. So Blood Moon's sitting there on its own, but Blood Moon's affecting Urborg. So what happens then?
It basically results in Urborg becoming a mountain.
Right.
Because Urborg is a mountain and doesn't have the opportunity to change anything. Because what happens is you have a dependency here. So Urborg says all lands are something else. That's not touching the enchantment that is Blood Moon.
Right, but Blood Moon is touching Urborg.
Correct.
So because of their dependent... Well, Urborg is dependent on Blood Moon, but Blood Moon is not dependent on Urborg. So you have to have Blood Moon win in order for that to work. Okay, sure. I'll take your word for it.
I double-checked that one as well.
Sure.
But like it's a good example of like where you can be like, oh, this is where timestamps are applied because it's on the same layer. But again, that is not always correct because there is a dependency clause as well with these things. So
look, I think we need to get to the really important part of this episode, which is like we're like stumbling through understanding how these things work.
Thank you for sticking with us for this length of the episode. We're just about done.
Just about. But like we need to leave people with what are you going to do when these things happen, right?
Yeah.
Because like yes,
well, the Space Commander says, how do we navigate this vast array of rules?
Yeah. So you know, yes, it's cool to like think about the layers and know what they are, and it's good to have more knowledge. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a time when someone's going to have a Blood Moon and you have an Urborg, and yes, now you know that one interaction. But how many other different versions of this interaction are there? You can't know all of the answers. So I guess we need to leave you with what are you going to do when these things happen? Yeah,
and I think there's like. The Get Commanded philosophy has always been, we want to have fun playing Commander. We want to give you guys more fun games of Commander. You say it at the start of every single episode.
Yeah.
So how are we going to advise you on approaching these situations? Well, I think the first approach that you can take is if you don't fully understand it and it's going to be confusing, you can actually, at the deck building process, at that moment, decide not to put it in your deck.
This is a classic example of, I mean, we talked about this, a similar problem with like Cathar's Crusade sorts of things.
We actually now refer to it as the Cathar's Crusade effect.
We do. So that was about the mental upkeep that was associated with these really complex, cards that do a lot of things at once that you have to keep track of. I think you can make exactly the same argument for cards that bend the rules in ways you don't understand and just go, look, if it's going to stress you out when you're playing it. Because if you play Blood Moon and Urborg and stuff, you're going to have moments of going, what on earth is going to happen here? I don't understand it.
Or if you feel like explaining Chain of Mephistopheles is going to cause you physical and emotional damage every time you play it.
Just don't put it in your deck.
Just don't put it in your deck. You can play other cards that are simpler and do what your deck wants to do.
I suppose the other thing you can do here is, even if you have the card in your deck, if you don't understand how something's going to play out and you think it's going to get stressful and complicated, just don't cast the spell.
Yeah.
Like if someone has an Urborg and you have a Blood Moon, and unless it's like absolutely right for you to do so, you can just not play Blood Moon. In fact, also as a deck building rule, you could just not play Blood Moon full stop. I'm going to go out and say.
Not even when you're playing a mono red Krenko deck. You can play it then.
Yeah, look, you got to be aware of what power level you're sitting in when you play Blood Moon, is what I would say.
Yeah.
It instantly says to so many other decks you don't get to play the game, and as we've talked about before, that's not such a good thing in so many power levels.
But look, I know obviously telling you just don't play confusing cards is gonna stop you from wanting to be better at Magic and all that kind of stuff. So we're not saying just don't play confusing cards or just ignore complicated rules.
Yeah.
You're gonna be faced with situations where you're gonna have to figure it out. And I think the first step is actually like, I liked the example that we said before of like being, teaching a kindergartner how to read. Break it down, sound it out. You can really go back and listen to where we were talking about the, if it says whenever, it's a triggered ability. Use these keywords like instead is going to help us identify replacement effects.
Yeah.
Think about the sentence structure of the card. How is it wanting you to read it? Breaking it down simply can really help you understand how a card actually works.
Yeah, a lot of Magic cards are laid out in a really logical way, and often just by stepping through, those different steps, just through logic, you can go, okay, I think I see why it's worded in this particular order and what the end result of that would be. But not always.
No.
So yes, trust your initial instincts, but also be aware that they're not always going to be correct because, things get complicated.
And look, 100% your last port of call should be ask a judge. If you are not already a member of our Discord, now is your time to join our Discord because you have access to a judge all the time on your phone. If you've got Discord on your phone, you can send that message in the chat.
Yeah.
And incredibly, Ellie and Vi, our two judges, are pretty quick at responding, even though they have very busy lives themselves. They're pretty quick with responding. And look, my advice is, even if you don't understand the judge's ruling, for the game that you're in, apply the ruling, play it as the judges said. Now then, after you finish the game, your Rule Infinity conversation would be, go and learn about that ruling, go and teach yourself, and then verify that with a judge.
Yeah.
Make sure you understand, especially if it's your card that causes the confusion. Like my Dark Salvation, I am now very aware of how that card's intricate working is, because I know that has caused multiple confusion at different tables, and I'm very aware of it being a confusing card. I'm able to explain it when I get into a game.
I actually, when I'm building a deck, will identify a few cards that I'm not certain exactly how they interact with other cards in my deck, and I'll ask a judge before I've ever even played them before, because I just want to understand how they work, because also knowing how they interact with specific cards, especially things like your commander, will affect how playable they are. I have asked so many questions to the judges about my Arami of the Dead Tide deck.
Yeah, by the way, when we talk to judges, we talk to them in the public Discord channel as well. So if you want to see Walt and I stumble through rules questions, that's the place to view it live.
You can probably guess some of the decks that I'm building based on the questions that I ask in advance of me building the decks.
I did see when you were building Mowu, there was a lot of how do replacement and +1 counters effects work.
I was asking a lot of questions about like, okay, Mowu says to replace like this. What if another card replaces like this? What's going to happen?
What happens then? happen.
Yep.
But look, sometimes judges aren't going to be around you all the time, or you'll message in our Discord and you won't get a reply instantly. So what do you actually do when you don't have a judge and everyone's confused? There is actually on the Wizards of the Coast website, if you go to magic-support.wizards.com, there's actually like a section of how to approach the social situation of playing casual Magic the Gathering and approaching rules. And I actually, from, where we're sitting as Get Commanded hosts, I love the fact that Wizards have done this, because this is basically Wizards saying you shouldn't let rules get in the way of fun.
Yeah, basically. We'll definitely link that in the show notes as well.
100%. Yeah, go check it out. It's really, honestly, it's quite a little simple page, but it basically just says, firstly, talk to the players at the table. If it's, especially in Commander games, you've got a lot of different opinions, and sometimes an effect resolving a particular way is beneficial for 3 people and terrible for 1, or it's the inverse. It's really good for 1 player and terrible for 3. Come to an agreement together of how you can resolve this to the best of your combined knowledge and ability.
If you pull together the mental resources of a whole commander table, there'll usually be at least a couple of experienced players there. And often I've heard really simple things be said, like, oh, actually, I used to play a card like this like 4 or 5 years ago in Standard, and this is how that card interacted. And look, a lot of the time, those will be pretty accurate to how this card will resolve too.
And it's something else you can do as well is like reverse a game action. If you're playing a casual game and you're like, okay, this stack is really, really confusing. It would have been simpler if I reacted at this point in the stack, then the whole thing can just resolve and we know how it works. You can reverse, if the table's like, actually, for the sake of the fun of the table, let's reverse it back so you can just counter the spell or do something or whatever it is. So that way the table can just be happy and continue on their merry way of playing a game.
Yeah. There's even been times in games that I've seen where someone has made an action that when we've all looked at it and realized would result in a draw because it results in like an infinite number of triggers that don't end the game.
An infinite loop that you can't stop.
Which always ends in a draw because the game can't move past it.
Imagine a computer just running the Magic the Gathering game, getting into an infinite loop, it will overheat and blow up. Draw.
It'll basically be the like, Magic the Gathering Arena is not responding.
.exe, please reboot.
Close the program is the equivalent of draw in this instance.
Troubleshooting, question mark?
Yeah, basically. We've had times where that's happened and we've just walked it back and just gone like, okay, obviously nobody wants a draw here. Let's just say you didn't cast that spell that resulted in a draw.
And look, something you can do as well, and we've done this with banned cards before, where someone will cast a card and there's another card that's maybe simpler or not banned, but like that's kind of easier to resolve on the table. If you have the mental capacity, you can replace that card with the card that you're thinking of just for that game.
Yeah.
Because then it's just easier to play and you can resolve the table and have everyone have a fun game of Commander.
Yeah, I mean, like, technically the rules would say if someone casts a banned card, they lose the game.
Yes.
Like, that, the rules would have to say they're disqualified or whatever.
Yep.
We're playing Commander. So, yeah, people don't always realize that Prophet of Crufix is banned. And so if that happens, you could very easily be like, okay, well, like...
That's a Seedborn Muse
It's
now.
pretty similar to Seedborn Muse. Let's just call it a Seedborn Muse. That's fine. You've paid 5 mana. You've got a creature. Like, we can resolve it like that.
Seedborn Muse is still fucking broken.
Yes.
So you go have your blue-pipped Seedborn Muse. Why not?
And your next Seedborn Muse that you cast, because I know you've got another one in that deck, that one's Tragic Arrogance. No.
Oh, look. The rules of Magic the Gathering are like an iceberg. Above the surface, you have things like Trample and what happens when you draw a card with no cards in your library. But underneath, there is a 281-page document with complexities such as replacement effects, layers, state-based actions, special actions, and so much more. So navigating this can be very tricky. However, remembering the basics, the assistance of the power of the internet and websites like Scryfall and Gatherer, and of course our best friends, the judges, rules don't have to be scary. Rules are in our game to make it work, not to stop us from having fun. So, Space Commanders, command received! We did it.
We did it.
Oh my lord, I was terrified of that episode.
It's a big one. This is our longest in quite a while.
Yeah.
So thanks for sticking with us. So listeners out there, do you feel commanded? What are some of your favorite rules interactions? I want to hear some really weird ones, definitely.
Yeah, if you've got examples of like how Layer 7 has come into play at one of your tables.
I want to hear those.
That's a really cool one. And if you want to tell us, there's plenty of ways to tell us your weird interactions of rules. You can get in touch touch with us by adding us on Twitter, sending us an email, or, as we've pushed a lot in this episode, joining our Discord, which is a great way to stay in touch with Walt and I, other members of our playgroup, and our beloved judges.
Absolutely. And you can support the Get Commanded podcast by leaving a review on whichever platform you're listening to it on, specifically Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can go to our podcast page on there and just hit 5 stars and say, Walt and James are funny.
They're the best.
Except when Walt marches around and pretends he's a Russian agent. I don't like that so much.
I'm going to be writing that review after this episode.
You can't do that on Google Podcasts. So if you listen there, just tell all your friends about it.
Yeah.
And in fact, just in general, if you have a couple of friends who are new to Magic or who are getting into Commander or want to understand it more or just enjoy 2 weird guys in Melbourne, Australia talking about random nonsense, recommend us to your friends.
I think this episode's a good one to forward on to friends that are interested in rules as well, for sure.
Yeah.
And look, if you want to support the Get Commanded podcast and its mission of getting you guys to have better Commander games, you can support us directly on Patreon, which is linked in the show notes. And there's a bunch of incredible rewards for you, like playing with us, getting access to different things, and we can help you rebuild a deck. There's so many good benefits on there, including patron shout outs. So we would personally like to thank Stella Tam and a special shout out to Fletcher Cutting for supporting us in the Space Commander tier. Fletcher, you are the best.
It's true. We'd also like to thank Palms Off Gaming, who sponsor this podcast. They make some really fantastic deck boxes, sleeves, binders, other gaming accessories, like even merch, clothing these days. Lots of really cool stuff out there for protecting your decks and showing off those blinged out cards. So definitely check them out at palmsoffgaming.com.au.
All right, it's tradition. Let's planeswalk out of here and go somewhere.
Your turn to planeswalk out of Magic and into somewhere else.
Yeah, well,
where are we planeswalking to?
I actually already kind of referenced it in this episode. You remember when I said I went camping with Ben?
Yeah.
I'd like to planeswalk back to that campsite.
Sure. So you went out. So it's a little Commander related.
Well, we played some Commander.
Sure.
We camped. The guys that I was camping with was myself, Ben, Brad, and Matt, who we've heard on this podcast before. They're great friends of mine.
Since high school.
And they're awesome, all great Commander players.
Love playing with all those guys. I love just hanging out with all of them.
Well, this is what this camping trip was all about, is we found that obviously we play a lot of Commander together, but we wanted to kind of ditch the game store or the kitchen table, and they're all scouts from way back, so they love the camping.
Sure.
Ben's got an incredible rooftop tent on his car and stuff like that.
I mean, he does a lot of outdoor work in his job as well. Yeah.
But we decided, right, let's go somewhere with no phone reception, let's go somewhere with beautiful hiking tracks, and let's just sit around a fire, drink a couple of beers together, talk about, and it was really lovely. I actually think there was we shed a tear around the fire talking about our personal feelings toward each other, and really toxic masculinity vibes. We were doing a really manly, let's go camping and get rugged in the wilds and go hiking and stuff. And
but in a way that wasn't about being competitive.
Correct,
and drinking yourself silly and
I didn't really even drink that much to get drunk. We were very relaxed. We went for a big hike out to the waterfalls up there.
Yeah.
For anyone that's local to Victoria, we're camping up in Murrindindi, which is northeast, so it's past up past the Yarra Valley, up in the north east of Victoria.
Sure. Really
beautiful spot.
Cool.
It's gorgeous, and honestly I just wanted to planeswalk back there today because kind of miss that campsite now. It was the feeling of not being connected to the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, as a content creator, it's pretty nerve-wracking because you're what am I going to get back to after not being online for a while?
Sure.
But I found it so rewarding. I wasn't thinking about my work emails. I wasn't doing any of that. But I have to admit, when the Dark Salvation ruling came up, I did really wish for the internet.
It's a really good opportunity to unplug, which I think all of us need.
Yeah.
It's very high-paced and very...
complicated world we live in.
Well, and just mentally demanding.
Yes.
The screens demand a lot from us, so it's good to get away from that sometimes.
More than ever.
Well, that's about all we have time for, so we'll see you next Friday for another transmission from the Space Commanders.
Goodbye, Commander players.